Before anyone in the park noticed the wind growing colder, before the pigeons scattered across the empty path, a small voice at a wooden bench asked a question no child should ever have to ask. Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow? The mother froze. But the second question was worse. And if we go back home, will Daddy hit you again? 20 feet away, a man who had built his reputation on fear slowly stopped walking. Because men like him were used to hearing screams, not whispers like that. Even the mafia boss couldn't ignore this. The park sat at the edge of Whitmore Heights, a neighborhood that had once been middle class and was now something quieter, something more tired. The benches were weathered. The paint on the playground equipment had chipped away in patches, revealing rusted iron underneath. A few oak trees still held their leaves, but most had surrendered them to the October wind, and they lay across the path in damp gold clusters that no one had bothered to sweep. It was the kind of park where people came to sit alone, where mothers pushed strollers without looking up, where old men read newspapers they'd already finished. It had a quality of forgetting about it, as if the park itself had been left behind by someone who never came back. Shelby Prewitt had chosen this bench because it was the farthest one from the road. She'd learned over the last 9 days that the farther you sat from the street, the less likely someone was to notice you, and right now, not being noticed was the only form of safety she had left. She was 30 years old. She had brown hair that hadn't been washed in 3 days, tied back with a rubber band she'd found in the pocket of her jacket. Her eyes were the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. The kind that comes from weeks of listening for footsteps, months of flinching at sudden sounds, years of holding your breath in your own kitchen, because the wrong word at the wrong time could change the temperature of a room in a single second. Her daughters sat beside her on the bench. Hadley was 7. Ruthie was 5. They wore mismatched jackets. Hadley in a pink zip-up that was too thin for the weather, Ruthie in an oversized gray hoodie that had once belonged to their neighbor's son. Their shoes were clean but scuffed. Their hair had been braided that morning by Shelby's hands, carefully, gently, the way she always did it, even when her fingers were shaking, because that was the thing about Shelby Prewitt. No matter how badly the world, pressed against her, she braided her daughter's hair every morning. She kissed their foreheads. She told them everything would be okay. And then she turned away and counted the money in her pocket and tried not to cry. Today, the money said $11.40. 9 days ago it had been $112. She'd taken what she could grab from the kitchen drawer the night she left. The night Trent had come home at 11:30, with whiskey still wet on his lips and an anger that had no direction until it found her face. He'd hit her before. That part wasn't new. But that night, he'd done it in front of the girls. Hadley had screamed. Ruthie had stood frozen in the hallway, holding a stuffed rabbit. Not blinking, not breathing, just watching. And something inside Shelby had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. Because broken meant you couldn't move. And Shelby had moved. She'd grabbed the emergency bag she kept in the back of the closet. The one with 2 changes of clothes for each girl. Her ID, a phone charger, and the small fold of cash she'd been hiding for 3 months. She'd carried Ruthie on her hip and held Hadley's hand and walked out the front door at midnight without shoes on. She hadn't gone back. She hadn't called anyone. Because there was no one to call. Her mother had died when she was 19. Her father had never been in the picture. Trent had spent the last 5 years making sure she had no friends left. No connections. No safety net. That was the architecture of his control. Not just the hitting, but the isolation. The slow removal of every person who might have told her she deserved more. And now she was sitting on a bench in a public park, feeding her daughters gas station rice, pretending this was a picnic. "Is this a restaurant?" Ruthie asked, looking at the styrofoam container with serious eyes. Shelby forced a smile. "It's better than a restaurant. It's a park picnic." Hadley didn't smile. She looked at her mother with the kind of stillness that made Shelby's chest ache. Because Hadley understood more than a 7-year-old should. She understood that picnics didn't happen on cold Tuesday afternoons. She understood that restaurants didn't come in gas station containers. She understood that her mother had been sleeping. sitting up for the last 4 nights because the back seat of the car didn't recline far enough. They ate slowly. Not because they weren't hungry, they were starving, but because both girls had learned, somewhere in the last 9 days, that eating slowly meant the food lasted longer, and lasting longer meant Mommy didn't look so scared. Ruthie chewed a small bite of rice and stared at the pigeons walking along the path. Hadley moved the beans around the container with her fork, arranging them into a little circle like she was building a wall around the last few bites. And then Hadley looked up. "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" Shelby's fork stopped. The air between them changed. It became heavier, like the sky had lowered itself a few inches closer to the earth. She opened her mouth to say something. Something comforting, something automatic, something a mother is supposed to say when her child asks a question that belongs in a world no child should live in. But before she could speak, Ruthie asked the second question. "And if we go back home, will Daddy hit you again?" Ruthie didn't say it the way an adult would have. She said it simply, as if she were asking about the weather, as if violence were just another thing that happened, like rain, like cold, like running out of food. And that was what made it unbearable, not the words themselves, but the way Ruthie had already learned to say them without flinching. Shelby pulled both girls closer. She didn't answer. She just held them and pressed her lips against the top of Hadley's head and closed her eyes and tried to keep her breathing steady. 20 feet behind them, Grady Ashworth had stopped walking. Grady didn't sit down right away. He stood near a tree just off the gravel path, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, his face turned slightly toward the bench where the woman and her daughters were sitting. He was not the kind of man people described with gentle words. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete. His eyes were gray-green and had the flat quality of a man who had learned, very early in life, not to show what he felt. His hair was dark, cut short, and there was a thin scar along the base of his left ear that most people never noticed, because most people didn't look at Grady Ashworth long enough to see it. He ran an organization that operated across 3 counties. He employed over 200 men. He had lawyers on retainer, judges who returned his calls, and a reputation that preceded him the way thunder precedes lightning. By the time you heard it, something had already struck. But Grady had not always been this. Once, he had been a boy named Grady who hid behind a couch while his father broke things. Once, he had been a child who knew what it meant to eat slowly because there wasn't enough. Once, he had been 7 years old, standing in the doorway of a kitchen in Decatur, Georgia, watching his mother hold a bag of frozen peas against her own face and whisper, "Don't tell anyone, baby. We're fine." He had not thought about that kitchen in years. But standing in this park, listening to a 5-year-old ask her mother whether her father would hit her again, the memory came back with a force that nearly took his breath. He stood there for a long time. He watched the woman pull her daughters close. He watched the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to make herself small enough to disappear. He watched the way the older girl kept looking around the park, not the way children look at things, with wonder or curiosity, but the way soldiers look at things, scanning, calculating, watching for danger, and Grady recognized that look because he had worn it himself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He texted one word to a man named Sullivan, who had worked with him for 12 years and never once asked a question that wasn't necessary. "Stay close." Then he put the phone away, and he sat down on a bench across the path. Shelby saw him. She noticed him the way she noticed every man now, with the quick, involuntary scan of a woman who had been trained by violence to assess threat in a single glance. His size, his posture, the way he sat with his arms resting on his knees, looking straight ahead. She pulled the girls a fraction closer, but the man didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He sat on his bench, like a man who had been there for hours, watching the pigeons, watching the leaves. And so Shelby turned her attention back to the only thing that mattered. "Listen to me," she whispered to her daughters. "We are going to be okay. Do you hear me? We are going to be okay." Hadley looked at her with those 2 old eyes. You said that yesterday. And I'll say it tomorrow, and the day after that. Are we going back to the car tonight? Shelby swallowed. Maybe. Or maybe we'll find somewhere warmer. Are we going to a hotel? Hotels cost money, baby. Hadley was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't need a bed. I can sleep sitting up. Like you do. The sentence hit Shelby in the center of her chest like a stone, because there it was, the proof that her daughter had been watching her sleep upright in the driver's seat, with her jacket balled against the window. Watching her skip meals so the girls could eat. Watching her pretend, every single hour of every single day, that she was not terrified. You shouldn't have to sleep sitting up, Shelby said softly. Ati, that's not your job. It's not your job either, Hadley said. And Shelby had no answer for that. Grady heard most of it, not because he was trying to listen, but because the wind carried sound in this park, the way rivers carry leaves, effortlessly, without permission, and what the wind brought him was a conversation that made him grip the edge of the bench until his knuckles whitened. He heard the mother say they might sleep in the car again. He heard the older girl say she could sleep sitting up. He heard the younger one ask about going home and whether her father would hit her mother again. And something in Grady Ashworth shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a transformation. It was more like a door opening in a hallway he'd walled off years ago. A hallway where a boy still hid behind a couch and a mother still whispered, "We're fine." His mother's name had been Colleen. She had worked 2 jobs, a diner in the morning and a cleaning service at night. She had kept Grady fed when there was no reason he should have been. She had taken every blow his father threw and absorbed it into her body like a sponge soaking up rain, and she had never once raised her voice in front of her son. She had died when Grady was 14, not from the beatings, from exhaustion, from a body that had simply been asked to endure too much for too long. He had never forgiven himself for not being old enough to protect her. He stood up from the bench. Shelby felt his approach before she saw it, the change in the air, the sound of footsteps on gravel. She turned, and the man in the dark coat was standing 6 feet away, his hands visible at his sides, his posture deliberately non-threatening. "I'm not going to bother you," he said. His voice was low, calm, and had the kind of control that came not from gentleness, but from discipline. "I just want to ask you something." Shelby's arms tightened around her girls. "We're fine." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and the moment they did, she heard her own lie. The same lie every woman in her situation has told 1,000 times. The lie that has been passed down like an heirloom of survival. The lie that means, please don't look too closely, because if you do, I might fall apart. Grady didn't react to the lie. He'd heard it before. From his own mother, in the same voice. "Your girls look cold," he said. "They're fine. The little one's jacket is too big. She keeps pulling the sleeves up so her hands can hold the fork." Shelby blinked. She hadn't noticed that. But Ruthie was, in fact, struggling with the sleeves of the oversized hoodie, pushing them back every few seconds so she could eat. "There's a diner 2 blocks east of here," Grady said. "Callahan's. They serve hot food. Real food. I'd like to buy your girls a meal." "We don't need—" "I know you don't need it. I'm asking if you'll accept it." The distinction mattered. Shelby heard it. The difference between someone telling you what you need and someone asking what you'll allow. It was a language she hadn't heard in 5 years. "Why?" she asked. Grady looked at the 2 girls on the bench. Hadley was staring at him with that same scanning expression, cautious, measuring, ready to move. Ruthie was looking at a pigeon. "Because I asked my mother the same kind of question once," Grady said. And nobody stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the direction of a conversation. It was the kind that tells you something true has been said, not performed, not rehearsed, but pulled from a place that doesn't open easily. Shelby studied his face. She had become an expert in reading men, in reading the difference between the ones who offered help and the ones who offered conditions, in reading mouths for cruelty and eyes for danger. She didn't find either in his face. She found something worse. She found recognition. "Okay," she whispered. Callahan's diner sat on the corner of Whitmore and 7th, a small brick building, with foggy windows and a bell above the door that rang when you walked in. The kind of place where the waitress called everyone "hon," and the coffee was always hot and slightly too strong. Grady walked ahead of them. Not beside them, not behind them. Ahead. Creating space, making it clear that the woman and her children were choosing to follow, not being led. When they entered, the waitress looked up from behind the counter. She saw Grady first, and her face changed the way faces do when someone powerful enters a room. Not fear exactly, but awareness. A slight adjustment. "Booth in the back," Grady said. The waitress nodded and led them to a corner booth with red vinyl seats and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Shelby sat with the girls on one side. Grady sat across from them. Ruthie stared at the laminated menu with wide eyes. "Mommy, they have pancakes." "You can have pancakes," Shelby said softly. "And eggs." "And eggs." Hadley didn't look at the menu. She looked at Grady. "Are you going to hurt us?" The question hung in the air, like a bird frozen mid-flight. Shelby immediately reached for Hadley's arm, but Grady held up one hand, gently, barely a gesture, and looked the 7-year-old in the eyes. "No," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hurt your mother, and if you don't want to stay, you can walk out that door right now and I won't follow." Hadley held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at Shelby. Shelby gave a small nod. Hadley picked up the menu. They ordered pancakes and eggs for Ruthie, a grilled cheese with tomato soup for Hadley, a club sandwich for Shelby that she ordered only because Grady said, "You should eat too." While they waited for the food, Grady asked nothing. He didn't press, he didn't interrogate. He sat with his hands on the table and let the silence do what silence does when it's offered without expectation. It gives people room to breathe. It was Shelby who spoke. "First, we left 9 days ago," she said. Her voice was low, directed at the table. "My husband, he was... You don't have to explain." "I want to, because I need someone to know." She paused. "He hit me for 5 years. I stayed because I thought I could control it. I thought if I was careful enough, quiet enough, good enough, I could keep it from reaching the girls. But he hit me in front of them. And Ruthie, she just stood there. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stood there holding her rabbit, and I knew that if I stayed one more night, she would grow up thinking that was normal." Grady said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and his right hand, resting on the table, slowly closed into a fist. "I took what I could," Shelby continued. "Cash from the kitchen drawer, a bag I'd packed. I drove for 6 hours. Ended up here. I don't know anyone in this city. I've been sleeping in the car with the girls. I found a shelter on the second night, but they were full. I tried another one. They had a wait list. I've been buying the cheapest food I can find and trying to make it last." She stopped, she looked at the window, and then she said the part she hadn't told anyone. "He called the police, Trent. He told them I kidnapped the girls. He told them I'm mentally unstable. He filed a report. There's an alert. Child Protective Services is looking for me." Her voice cracked. "If they find me, they'll take my girls. They'll send them back to him and he won't hurt them. Not yet. But they'll grow up in that house, with that man. And they'll learn what I learned. That love looks like control, and kindness comes with conditions." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have $11 left. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have family. I don't have a plan. I just have them." She looked at Hadley and Ruthie. Hadley was drawing on the paper placemat with a crayon the waitress had left. Ruthie was watching the cook through the kitchen window, fascinated by the way he flipped something on the griddle. "They're everything," Shelby whispered. Grady looked at those two girls. He looked at the way Hadley drew a house on the placemat. 4 walls, a triangle roof, 2 windows, a door, no father in the picture, just 3 stick figures, a tall one and 2 small ones. And something in Grady Ashworth made a decision, not the kind of decision he made in boardrooms or back offices, not the kind that involved leverage or territory or money, the kind that came from the hallway he'd walled off, the kind that came from a 14-year-old boy who had stood beside his mother's hospital bed and promised himself that if he ever had the power to protect someone, he would not look away. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Sullivan, I need 2 things. A room at the Westin. Clean. Quiet. Long term. Under a name I'll give you, and I need Margaret Calloway's number. He hung up. Shelby stared at him. Who's Margaret Calloway? She's a family attorney, one of the best in the state. She handles cases like yours, custody disputes, protective orders, abuse documentation. She doesn't lose. I can't afford. She's on retainer. Whose retainer? Mine. Shelby shook her head. I can't take that. I don't even know your name. Grady, and you're not taking anything. I'm placing a phone call. The decision to accept what comes from it is entirely yours. The food arrived. Ruthie's eyes went wide when the pancakes were set in front of her. A short stack with butter and syrup on the side, steam curling off the top like a small warm prayer. Mommy, Ruthie said, these are the biggest pancakes I've ever seen. Eat them slow, baby. I don't want to eat slow anymore. Ruthie looked at Shelby with her enormous brown eyes. I want to eat like a normal kid. Shelby pressed her lips together and looked away. Grady watched the mother fight to hold herself together in front of her daughters, and he recognized that fight. He had watched his own mother fight it every night at the dinner table, smiling through a swollen lip, laughing through a bruised rib, pretending the world was safe while her body told a different story. Hadley ate her grilled cheese carefully, tearing it into 4 equal pieces before eating the first one. She dipped each piece into the tomato soup and chewed with a seriousness that made her look twice her age. Shelby ate half her sandwich and wrapped the rest in a napkin. A habit, a survival instinct. Save what you can for later because later is never guaranteed. Grady noticed. He didn't comment, but when the waitress came back, he ordered a second meal to go. For later, he said, looking at Shelby, in case they're hungry tonight. She didn't argue. When the meal was finished, Grady's phone buzzed. Sullivan had secured a suite at the Weston Arms. Not the kind of place that asked questions. Clean rooms, key card access, a small kitchen, and a door that locked from the inside. It was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the city, known to certain people, invisible to others. There's a room waiting, Grady said. It's paid for. 2 weeks to start. No name on record. No one will know you're there. Why 2 weeks? Because Margaret needs time. She'll file an emergency protective order. She'll begin documenting the abuse. She'll petition the court to dismiss the kidnapping claim and establish you as the custodial parent. 2 weeks is what she needs to build the foundation. Shelby's hands were trembling, not from fear this time, but from something she hadn't felt in years. The terrifying, fragile possibility that someone was telling the truth. What about Trent? What about him? He'll look for us. He won't stop. Grady's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The way water shifts beneath ice, invisible unless you know what to look for. He won't find you. You don't know him. I don't need to know him. I know what he is, and men like that only have power over people who are alone. He paused. You're not alone anymore. Shelby stared at him across the table. The fluorescent light of the diner hummed above them. Ruthie was drawing a smiley face in the leftover syrup on her plate. Hadley was watching Grady the way she watched everything, with caution and something that might, in the right light, be the very earliest shape of trust. Why are you doing this? Shelby asked. You don't know me. Grady looked at the window. For a moment, his face changed. The controls softened. The mask moved half an inch. And behind it was not the man who ran an organization or made phone calls that rearranged people's lives. Behind it was the boy who had hidden behind a couch in Decatur, Georgia, listening to his mother's voice saying, "We're fine." My mother's name was Colleen, he said quietly. She worked 2 jobs. She never complained. She took everything my father gave her and she turned it into something that looked like a normal life. She died when I was 14. Not from what he did to her body, from what it cost her to survive it. He looked back at Shelby. Nobody helped her. Nobody stopped. People saw. Neighbors heard. Teachers noticed bruises on her arms when she came to pick me up from school. But nobody did a single thing, because it was easier to look away. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. I'm not looking away. The room at the Weston Arms was on the 4th floor. 2 beds, a small couch, a kitchenette with a microwave and a mini fridge. The sheets were white and clean. The bathroom had towels that smelled like soap. There was a lock on the door, a deadbolt, and when Shelby turned it, the sound of the latch sliding into place was the loudest, most beautiful sound she had heard in 9 days. Ruthie climbed onto one of the beds and bounced twice, then stopped and looked at Shelby. "Is this ours?" "For now." "Can I sleep lying down?" The question destroyed Shelby. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Ruthie into her arms and held her so tightly that Ruthie patted her back and said, "It's okay, Mommy. I like sleeping sitting up too." And Shelby cried, not the quiet, controlled tears she'd been holding behind her eyes for 9 days, real tears. The kind that come from the bottom of something that has been pressed down for so long it forgot it existed. She cried with her face in her daughter's hair and her arms around both girls, and she cried until her body had nothing left to give. Hadley held her mother's hand through it. She didn't speak. She just held on. Because at 7 years old, Hadley Prewitt understood something that most adults never learn, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do for someone is simply not let go. Grady was not in the room. He had walked them to the building, handed Shelby the key card, and said, "Margaret will call you tomorrow morning. Answer the phone." Then he had turned and walked down the hallway. No fanfare, no expectation, no request for gratitude, just the sound of his shoes on the carpet and the quiet click of the elevator door. Margaret Calloway called at 8:14 the next morning. She had a voice like a woman who had spent 30 years arguing in courtrooms and winning, sharp, specific, and kind in the places where kindness mattered. She asked Shelby to tell her everything, and Shelby did. She told her about the first time Trent hit her. 3 months into the marriage, a slap across the face because dinner was late. She told her about the escalation, the punches, the choking. The night he threw her against the hallway wall, so hard the plaster cracked, and Hadley, who was 4 at the time, came out of her bedroom and asked if there was an earthquake. She told her about the isolation, how Trent had systematically removed every person from her life, her college friends, her co-workers, her neighbor who used to bring over cookies on Sundays. One by one, Trent had found a reason to push them away. Jealousy, accusations, manufactured conflicts, until Shelby had no one left but him. Oh, she told her about the night she left, about the look on Ruthie's face, about the rabbit. Margaret listened to every word. Then she said, "I'm filing an emergency motion today. I need you to do one thing. I need you to write down every incident you can remember. Dates, times, details, every bruise, every threat, every time you went to a hospital or should have gone to a hospital. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good. I'm also contacting a domestic violence advocacy group that will assign you a caseworker. They'll help you access emergency funds, medical care, and housing assistance beyond the 2 weeks. You won't be doing this alone." "What about the kidnapping report?" "It's a common tactic," Margaret said. "Abusers file false reports to maintain control and force the other parent to return. The courts see through it when the documentation is strong. And your documentation is going to be strong. I'll make sure of it." "And CPS?" "I'll handle CPS. If they make contact, you refer them to me. You say nothing without me present. Understood?" "Understood." "Shelby, one more thing." "Yes?" "You did the right thing, leaving, running, protecting your girls. I know it doesn't feel like it right now. I know it feels like you're being hunted for doing the one thing any mother would do. But you did the right thing, and we're going to prove it." When the call ended, Shelby sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her daughters. Hadley was eating a granola bar from the go bag. Ruthie was asleep, curled on her side with her mouth slightly open, her oversized hoodie bunched around her like a cocoon. For the first time in 9 days, Shelby exhaled. Not all the way, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel the air reach the bottom of her lungs. Enough to feel the faintest suggestion that the ground beneath her might hold. Over the following days, things began to move in ways Shelby hadn't thought possible. Margaret filed the emergency protective order. A judge reviewed the documentation. The hospital visit Shelby had made 3 years ago for a fall that fractured 2 ribs. The photographs a neighbor had once taken of bruises on her arms, the school counselor's report noting Hadley's anxiety and withdrawal, and granted the order within 48 hours. Trent Pruitt was served at his home. The order prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of Shelby or the girls. The kidnapping report was flagged for investigation, and when detectives reviewed the timeline, the midnight departure, the lack of any prior custody dispute, the hospital records, the counselor's notes, they quietly moved the case to the bottom of the pile and opened a new file, one with Trent's name on it. Margaret arranged a meeting with CPS. She sat beside Shelby in a small conference room while a caseworker named Dennis reviewed the documentation. Dennis was a quiet man with reading glasses and a folder full of forms. He looked at the evidence. He looked at Shelby. He looked at the two girls sitting in the waiting room outside, drawing with crayons on the backs of old intake forms. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "based on what I've reviewed, I see no indication that these children are at risk in your care. I see every indication that they were at risk in the home they left." He closed the folder. "The alert has been rescinded." Shelby put her hands over her face and sobbed. Grady did not visit the Weston Arms. He did not call Shelby. He did not insert himself into the process Margaret was managing. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that protection did not mean presence. That sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for someone was to set the machinery in motion and then step back. But he kept watch. Sullivan reported to him daily. The room was secure. The woman and her children were safe. Margaret's filings were progressing. The husband had been served and had reportedly thrown a chair through his kitchen window when he read the order. Grady received that last piece of information without expression. Then he made another call. This one was shorter, and the man on the other end understood, without being told explicitly, that Trent Pruitt's name had been noted, that certain boundaries had been drawn, and that crossing them would be inadvisable in ways that no legal document could adequately describe. It was not a threat. Grady didn't make threats. Threats were for men who needed to announce their power. Grady simply made sure that the appropriate people understood the situation, and the situation understood itself. 2 weeks after the night in the park, Shelby and the girls moved into a small apartment on the west side of the city. It was a one-bedroom with a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a single maple tree. The rent was covered for 6 months through an emergency assistance fund Margaret had connected her to. A domestic violence organization had provided furniture, a bed, a couch, a small table with 3 chairs. A volunteer had dropped off a box of kitchen supplies, a bag of groceries, and a stuffed bear for Ruthie that was almost as big as she was. Hadley walked into the apartment and stood in the center of the living room and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. "Is this ours?" she asked. "Yes," Shelby said. "For real?" "For real." Hadley looked at the door, at the lock, at the deadbolt. "Can we lock it?" "We can always lock it." Hadley walked to the door and turned the deadbolt herself. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the metal, feeling the weight of it, the solidity. Then she turned around and, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not the cautious, managed smile of a child who knows better. A real smile. The kind that starts at the mouth and travels to the eyes, and doesn't stop until it reaches somewhere deep inside the chest, where trust lives, or where trust begins to rebuild. Ruthie found her room, or their room, the single bedroom that would hold 2 small beds once they arrived, and declared it the biggest room in the whole world, even though it was barely 12 feet across. "Can I put stickers on the wall?" Ruthie asked. "You can put anything you want on the wall." Ruthie looked at Shelby with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. The kind of joy that only exists in children who have been given something so simple and so enormous that they don't yet have the language to name it. Safety. That was the word. But Ruthie didn't know it yet. She just knew that the door locked and the bed was soft, and her mother was sitting on the couch without looking over her shoulder. 3 months later, on a January afternoon, so cold the windows of Callahan's diner had fogged over from the inside, Shelby walked through the door with both girls. They were dressed warmly now. Proper jackets, proper shoes. Hadley had a purple backpack slung over one shoulder, She'd started second grade at a school 3 blocks from the apartment. Ruthie had a drawing rolled up in her hand, the edges curling from being carried too tightly. The diner was the same. The bell rang. The waitress said, "Hun." The coffee was too strong. They sat in the same booth. Red vinyl. Window to the parking lot. Shelby ordered pancakes for Ruthie. Grilled cheese and tomato soup for Hadley. A club sandwich for herself that she ate all of, this time, without wrapping the second half in a napkin. Hadley looked up from her soup. "Mom, can we come here every Tuesday?" "If you want." "I want." Ruthie held up her drawing. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of a building with a tree. The tallest figure had brown hair. The 2 smaller figures had braids. Above them, in shaky purple crayon, Ruthie had written a single word. Home. Shelby looked at that word and felt something inside her chest that had been clenched for 5 years, maybe longer, finally, slowly, carefully begin to open. She pressed the drawing to her heart and closed her eyes. Behind her, through the fogged window, a dark car idled at the edge of the parking lot. Inside it, a man in a wool coat looked at the diner for a long moment. He could see, through the blurred glass, the shapes of a woman and 2 small girls in a corner booth. He could see the older girl dipping something into soup. He could see the younger one holding up a piece of paper. He couldn't see what the paper said, but something about the way the mother held it against her chest told him everything he needed to know. Grady Ashworth put the car in drive, and for the first time in 20 years, the boy behind the wall, the one who had hidden behind the couch, who had listened to his mother whisper, "We're fine," who had promised himself he would never look away, finally felt the weight of that promise lift. Not because the world had changed, but because in one small corner of it, he hadn't looked away. He drove into the gray winter light and did not look back. Because looking back was for people who doubted what they'd done, and Grady had no doubts. Not about this. The bell above the diner door rang again as someone walked in. Cold air swept across the floor. Ruthie looked up from her pancakes and smiled at no one in particular. And somewhere in a small apartment on the west side of the city, a deadbolt waited faithfully in its locked position, holding the door shut against a world that had once been too dangerous to live in. But not anymore, not for them, not today.